take it away.
Thank you. So this is not an overview of the entire curation process, but it is instead a focus on specifically the different levels of curation that we go through in the curation process that I hope will give you an understanding of why we've chosen to go through all these different levels and what they mean when you see them on Fair Data Services. Next slide, please. That's me. I'm not sure that I need to read the whole introduction of myself because I'm pretty sure that most folks on this call know me, but those of you who are watching this pre-recorded version someday in the future can hit pause and read all about me if you would like to. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the curation levels, and they're divided into two main parts, the pre-standardization levels and the standardization levels. So I'll go into each of these in more detail in a few slides. Next slide, please. But first, I want to present this chart that gives you an overview of the different features that we acquire with each curation level. So as you can see, starting with ingest and moving all the way through Fair Variables 3, different features get added. The data gets improved in different ways. So upon ingest, for example, it undergoes data checks. During the Fair Metadata process, dictionaries become available, and you can start to access the data via the Fair Data Services. And as we move into Fair Variables 3, finally, at the end of the process, you reach data that's fully curated and harmonized. And I should actually talk about FAIR for a little bit before this. The real purpose of these curation efforts is to make our data sets as fair as possible. That means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So if you've seen any of my other presentations, you've seen me talk about that. That comes up every time. And it's really just about making the data as useful as possible, but also doing it as quickly as possible. That's why we go through the different levels or stages of curation. Next slide, please. So let's start with pre-standardization. This is level 0, the data comes into us. This is basically just a set of manual and automated checks to make sure that we have the data that we were expecting, make sure that there's no PHI information included in it, and to get it into a secure repository where it is, that original version is always maintained. That's pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. Then we move into Fair Metadata or pre-standardization curation. The first step is what we call Fair Metadata 2, and in public, that's what we call it internally. Externally facing, the level that gets recorded on the Fair Data Services is called raw. So this is basically the data as it's come to us, but we add a catalog that is DCAT compliant, so a standardized data catalog that describes the data. If the data came to us with dictionaries and single tables already, we'll go ahead and upload those during that Fair Metadata 1 process as well. But we don't do any additional curation. So the idea of the benefit of this is that it gets the data sets uploaded and visible very quickly, even in their raw form, so people can at least know what we have. Next slide, please. Then we move on, excuse me, to the Fair Metadata 2 level. So this is doing a little bit more curation. It's not standardizing it yet, but we are at least making it so that the data sets are broken into a format that can be reused in the RDCA-DAP platform. So if, for example, if someone sends us an Excel workbook with a bunch of sheets, we break those all into single sheets. We convert them to CSV so that they can be uploaded. We make sure that every data table that we load has a dictionary. We fix any non-SQL compliant variable names, little things so that they can work within the platform. And if we discover any real issues, then we remove those. Like, for example, if we discovered some additional PHI, let me point out that during that Fair Metadata 1 process, only the metadata are uploaded to our Fair Data portal. So there is no publicly visible data. There's still no publicly visible data during this Fair Metadata 2 or non-standardized curation process, but the data have been prepared so that they are requestable through the platform. And so again, this is making those data sets a bit more clear for our users and accessible in a very early stage. This process usually takes about a couple of weeks to happen for each data set. Next, please. And then we recently broke Fair Metadata 1 down, we recently broke Fair Metadata 2 down into 2 stages, which is 2 and 3. So we first go through that non-standardized process. of getting the data loaded into the FAIR data resources, but we also then go through this next step, which is cleaning. So the reason we separated this out is because it can actually take quite some time to go this back and forth with the data contributor to make sure that they're addressing any unanswered questions, and we want to go through and do any cleaning processes like fixing typos, identifying outliners, and again, making sure that there's no PHI information in there. In that previous FM2 step, if there were PHI, we would just simply redact the entire free text fields. In this case, we leave the free text fields in place, but only redact the PHI. So you can see this is a more manual process that takes a bit longer. So it can add another week or two onto that curation process. And the nice thing about adding these cleaning steps is it then prepares the data to be ready for the next process, which is standardization. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're moving into what we call FAIR variables, and we're starting to actually standardize not just the metadata that describes the data set, but the actual variables and the values within the data set itself, and we're starting to standardize those. So we have cleaned them up in the last one. We're going to start to standardize them here. We map them to different standardized terminologies that are part of the OMOP vocabulary. So that includes LOINC, SNOMED, a number of different vocabularies. There are about 50 of them that are used as standards within OMOP. And we make sure that we enforce naming conventions across all of the different data dictionaries. So at this standardization level, we're achieving the same level of standard that previous earlier c-path users would recognize from Coder, and that we have this searchable metadata though on top of it. And we're also moving, because we're moving it into the OMOP model, it's in a relational database format that's quick. It makes it very quick and easy to create analysis subsets. This step does require some input from the stakeholders or whoever plans to be using the data. Consortia is not exactly relevant within, RDCA-DAP, where we're all sort of one big consortium, but it's still, whoever, we basically don't progress to this step unless someone has said, hey, I want to use this data and here's what I want to use it for. So that gives us some idea about which variables we should standardize first. And this process can take quite some time. It can take up to 7 weeks, depending on how large and how many variables have been selected. But it does make the data very, very fair, very reusable, and very easy to integrate with other data sets. Next step, please. Or next slide, please. So the next curation level is FAIR variables 2. This is essentially a continuation of the previous curation level, but we're adding more variables. So whereas in FAIR variables 1, we're going to focus on the most important variables. So for example, we'll probably almost always do the demographics domain and data about laboratory results, data about patient visits, for example, if they exist. But then there might be, in FAIR variables 2, there might be additional data that's needed for a particular study that gets curated here. And again, like with the last FAIR variables 1, we do need input from the users about what they're going to do with this. And we think it's really important that there should be a statistical analysis plan beforehand to help guide the variables, rather than just saying, well, give me everything. We could be like, well, why should we spend our time curating everything if you don't know what you're going to actually analyze with it, right? Because you've got the data in the FAIR metadata 1 already, 2 already, you can go in and see what's there. And that gives you a really good way, that you being the users gives you a very good way to go in and actually choose which variables you would like for additional analysis. And next slide, please, is just FAIR variables 3 is essentially the same process, but doing it to all of the data that's relevant. But what gets added on here as an additional step is that we also then begin to map the data to ontologies. So OMOP is a standardization. At some level, you could call it an ontology, but it doesn't really have the rich semantics that most OWL ontologies would have. And so throughout this curation, starting with FAIR variables 1 and then culminating in FAIR variables 3, at the same time we've got our data managers curating it, mapping to OMOP, we've also got data engineers and data scientists mapping the OMOP vocabularies to OWL ontologies that provide the additional layer of semantics. And the advantage of that is then, of course, you've not only really got these nice, clean, standardized data sets, but you've got them integrated across multiple data sets, regardless of the disease area, that allow you to do additional exploration and discovery through a knowledge graph, which we will be working on over the coming year. And I think that's the last slide. Let's see if there's any more. That was it. Thank you.